Hello, Daisy Cakes! Every 6 months, I review the books I read, courtesy of Shove It or Shove It, the incredibly silly TBR game where I pick books based solely on their covers. Why do I do that? Because I'm Daisy X Machina, the drag queen detective who investigates all things speculative in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Now, I'll be looking at the books I've chosen and read from July 2024 to December 2024. I will either zap a book, which means I do not recommend it, or bless a book, which means I absolutely do recommend it. For some reason, I ended up with 4 horror books and 2 science fiction. So, without further ado, let's jump into it. In July, I picked Someone You Can Build a Nest In by John Wiswell from the horror category. The cover is amazing. The title is tongue-in-cheek. There's this cosmic horror vibe to it. By that I mean Lovecraftian. I was so intrigued by the cover, I had to pick it for my TBR. Now, after reading it, I would not classify this novel as horror. In my opinion, it leans more towards traditional fantasy. It also has this weird, dark lesbian romance to it. The main character is a monster named Shishishen who lives in the ruins of a castle in a forest and eats mostly animals, but also the occasional hero who tries to slay her. Shishishen is basically a big blob that can shape herself into whatever she wants, including looking human. And while she's in human form, she meets a woman warrior named Homily, who is seeking to kill the monster who cursed her family. While these two beings fall in love, it suddenly occurs to Shishishen that the monster that Homily is looking for is her. This is really quirky. Yes, it has a big romance subplot, but the romance is so unconventional that I thought it was a delight to read. Now, I thought from the cover and the title that the story might be humorous or satirical, but it really isn't. There is some whimsy since the story is told from the point of view of the monster Shishishen, but I would not call this a funny book. Anyway, if you can't tell, I really enjoyed the novel, and of course it gets my blessing. In August, I picked The Family Experiment by John Marrs from the science fiction category. I was very intrigued by the minimalist cover that looks kind of dingy with this line of silhouettes of people, except for the middle person, that I thought it looked like their head was chopped off, but apparently it was a child with a splash of blood on them. I assumed it was some weird genetic experiment or biological science fiction. I couldn't be further from the truth. It's about a virtual reality game set, and I think it's this ultra-conservative version of England in the near future. Apparently, people don't have kids because kids are so expensive. And I really had a hard time buying into the whole premise of why people don't have kids. Anyway, this virtual reality game gives couples a virtual baby that grows up like a real child, except at a very accelerated pace. And the couple that wins either gets a free virtual baby or a real baby. I have to tell you, the whole premise of the story felt really silly to me, and I had a big problem suspending my disbelief to really get into the story. Anyway, there's a bunch of couples, and it did include one gay couple, so it didn't really feel like an ultra-conservative society. Anyway, each couple gets this virtual child, and each couple is in some way or form nuts. They're in this virtual reality taking care of this virtual child, which is pretty much a 24/7 job where at least one parent has to be with the child. And they're broadcast live and are subjected to intense social media scrutiny. Each couple, like I said, is nuts, and there's lots of interesting twists and turns that culminates to a surprise ending. Again, for me, the whole speculative premise was difficult to buy into, so I have to zap The Family Experiment. Now, I do think this novel was well written, and maybe you'll like it, it just wasn't for me. In September, I picked Glass Houses by Madeline Ashby, yet another science fiction novel. I thought from the cover that this was going to be some sort of mirror reality, since there's a mirror image of a house and maybe an alternate dimension or something like that. But once again, I was way off base. And that's the problem with picking books solely by their covers, because you make a lot of assumptions that can be really wrong. Anyway, this is another near future novel, only this one is about a high-tech firm that I think does something with AI, where the top executives, including the president and founder, are on an AI airplane that crashes into the ocean and kills a bunch of the executives, but the rest are marooned on this spooky island that has this one really weird high-tech house on it. This is more a thriller than science fiction, and I could get into that, except it does the one cardinal sin that really should never happen in a thriller. The pacing regularly comes to a hard stop because the book is split into two stories. One story is the exciting thriller about the plane crash in the weird spooky house and people keep dying, and I like that story. The other story is a flashback about the business and how it got started and funded, and I could care less about that story. But we kept flip-flopping between these two stories, and the pacing, because of that, the pacing just felt really stop and go. And the long flashback story does inform the plane crash story, but in my opinion, it came at the expense of the pacing, because this could have been, I think, a really interesting, fast-paced thriller if it just focused on the plane crash in the island. So I guess I'm going to have to zap Glass Houses. In October, I picked The Queen by Nick Cutter for horror. The reason I picked it is because of this retro cover. The cover reminded me of early Stephen King novels, which I love. I assumed I was picking up this Stephen King-esque novel, which I thought maybe was about a girl that psychically controls bees or wasps or insects or something like that. First, the writing is nothing like Stephen King. It is about a girl who is genetically altered to control insects. I hated the beginning. It has this prologue that starts with this horrific scene that you don't understand what's happening and you don't know who any of these characters are. And then the next chapter starts one day earlier that builds to the wacko horror of the prologue. And I am so tired of books and TV shows that open with basically it's the climax of the story and then it jerks you back and restarts the story. Can we just stop doing that? Can we just start at the beginning of the story without any flash forwards? This is definitely a horror novel. There are some super creepy scenes that will make you squirm, and it can be very graphic, and I thought it was very raw. It's about a girl named Margaret whose friend Charity has disappeared weeks ago. A mysterious phone shows up on Margaret's doorstep that seems to have text messages from Charity. There's also this mad billionaire who's doing secret experiments because of his own wild childhood trauma involving a species of African ants. I think I'll have to zap The Queen. I personally just did not enjoy this novel, but I do appreciate the writing, and the premise was interesting. If you do pick it up, I have to warn you that the writing, like I said, is raw, and it does get pretty intense and graphic. In November, I picked Thrum by Meg Smitherman, also in the horror category, because look at the cover. The eyes of the main character are so haunting and spooky. I had to figure out what is going on. First off, this is a novella, so it's a very fast read. It's a science fiction horror set in the far future where this spaceship is scouting, I think, for habitable planets. The spaceship has a crew of 4 who are in deep sleep, but everyone dies except for one, Amy. When Amy wakes up and investigates the ship, she can't send a distress call because the communications array has been sawed off, and there's almost no fuel, even though there should be more than enough left. Amy is rescued by this alien ship that is really alien. Like the ship could be alive and the interior constantly reshapes itself. There's also a being on the ship who looks human called Dorian. Amy thinks she's being rescued. She hates being attracted to Dorian because it seems like Dorian was constructed to be attractive specifically to her. And nothing makes sense, like why the communications array has been cut away or why the fuel is so low. Anyway, I kind of figured things out early of what's going on, but I still enjoyed the short read. I give Thrum my blessing. I think it would have gotten a little bit boring or tiring if it was a full-length novel. I think the novella length is perfect for this story. Last on the list, I picked Evil in Me by Brom in December, again from the horror category. The cover was amazing. It looks like this retro album cover from the 70s or 80s. Brom is apparently an artist as well as an author because he did the cover, and there are some additional drawings in this book which are amazing if you like this type of artwork. I've never heard of Brom, but apparently he writes and illustrates his own books, which is kind of neat. Anyway, Devil in Me is about a demonic ring. Yes, I also thought of the One Ring from Lord of the Rings, but this cursed ring is surrounded by Jewish mysticism, which I thought was really interesting about demons and unmade humans and Jewish cabals dedicated to keeping these sorts of demonic artifacts secure. Obviously, this ring isn't so secure and finds its way to a woman named Ruby Tucker. Ruby is our main character, who kind of isn't very likable at the beginning. She's working at the YMCA as some kind of community service for a crime she committed. She also stopped taking her medication for these bouts of rage that she gets into. So you aren't meant to like her at the start. And honestly, at least for me, she wasn't very sympathetic. Of course, things go from bad to worse once a demonic ring gets in the picture. For some reason, she figures out there's a way to get rid of the ring by singing a song to a crowd to borrow their energy. I have to say, I really enjoyed the last half of the book when Ruby is working towards finding a booking to sing her song. The story is really good. I just don't know why it took half the book to get there. The first half of the book for me was kind of slow and it felt like we were wallowing in the horrible life of Ruby. You really come to dislike several of the other characters, including her stepfather's son, who's a real piece of work. I personally wish we got to the second half a lot sooner, but it is what it is. I still give Evil in Me my blessing. Now, why did I pick so many horror novels? I don't know. Probably because I just started including horror this year and was excited to find new horror writers, or it could just be that the covers were so much better than science fiction and fantasy. All in all, this was not a great last half of the year since I zapped 3 of the 6 books, but of all the books I read, my biggest recommendation is For Someone You Can Build a Nest In by John Wiswell. Now, like I said, I would not call Someone You Could Build a Nest In a horror novel. I think of it as a quirky, dark fantasy. If you are more interested in traditional horror, Or what I think is traditional horror, my favorite is probably Evil in Me by Brom. I definitely am interested in checking out more of Brom's books. But what about you? Did you read any of these books, or do you want to read any of them? Let me know down in the comments. And while you're there, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Until we meet again, may all the books you read be